The dealership sat on Highway 14 just outside Huron, South Dakota. Red metal building with silver trim. Big Massey Ferguson sign out
All right,
front
bring it
that
up
had been
slow.
there since 1968.
Watch the corner on the left.
32
Okay, hold it
acres
right
of
there.
paved
Look
lot
straight.
space where equipment sat in neat rows organized by category. Tractors on the east side, combines and hay equipment on the west, used inventory in the back. The parts department took up the entire north wing of the building, climate controlled, organized by a system that only made sense to the three guys who'd worked there for over 20 years. And in the middle of it all, in an office with windows that looked out over the shop floor, sat Leonard Jorgensen, 71 years old, third-generation equipment dealer, owner of Jorgensen Implement since his father handed him the keys in 1979. Leonard had grown up in that building, literally. His grandfather had started the business in 1947, selling Ford tractors and international harvester equipment to farmers recovering from the war. His father had transitioned to Massey Ferguson in 1968, when the brand started gaining traction in the upper Midwest. And Leonard had spent his entire adult life building relationships with farming families across 6 counties. He knew their operations, knew their kids, knew which ones were expanding and which ones were struggling. He'd financed first tractors for young farmers just starting out. He'd helped operations transition through generational handoffs, and he'd watched farms that had been customers since his grandfather's time evolve through 5 decades of agricultural change. The dealership wasn't the biggest in South Dakota. It wasn't the flashiest, but it was respected. Farmers knew that when Leonard gave you a price, it was fair. When his service department gave you a timeline, they hit it. When you had a breakdown during harvest and called at 9 p.m., someone answered. That reputation had been built over 50 years through thousands of small decisions that prioritized relationships over transactions. And by 2018, Leonard had 340 active customer accounts, $4.2 million in annual parts and service revenue, and equipment sales that averaged $8.7 million per year. But Leonard was 71. His wife had died 3 years earlier. His son worked in software in Minneapolis and had zero interest in farm equipment. His daughter lived in Denver and visited twice a year. And Leonard was tired. Tired of the hours, tired of the stress, tired of competing with mega dealers that had corporate backing and marketing budgets he couldn't match. He'd been thinking about retirement for 5 years, but hadn't pulled the trigger because he didn't know what would happen to the business. Selling to another Massey Ferguson dealer made sense, but there weren't many left in the region. AGCO's dealer network had been consolidating for years. Independent operations like Leonard's were becoming rare. Then in April 2018, Leonard got a call from a John Deere regional development manager named Craig Whitmore. Craig said he wanted to meet, talk about potential opportunities. Leonard assumed it was a courtesy call. Maybe Deere was looking to place equipment in his used inventory on consignment. Maybe they wanted to discuss parts cross-compatibility. He agreed to meet. Craig drove down from Sioux Falls and showed up in a suit that probably cost more than Leonard's truck. They sat in Leonard's office and Craig got straight to the point. He said John Deere was expanding its dealer footprint in central South Dakota. They'd identified Huron as a strategic location, and they wanted to acquire Jorgensen Implement. Not partner with it, not affiliate with it, buy it outright, building, land, inventory, customer list, everything. Craig slid a folder across the desk with a preliminary offer, $6.8 million. All cash. 60-day close. Leonard sat there staring at the number. It was more money than he'd ever seen in one place. More than he'd make if he ran the dealership for another 10 years. It was retirement. Security. The ability to stop worrying about cash flow and inventory turns and whether some farmer's check would clear. But it also meant the end of Jorgensen Implement, the end of 50 years of Massey Ferguson representation in Huron, the end of relationships his family had built over 3 generations. Leonard asked what would happen to his staff. Craig said Deere would evaluate everyone and retain the employees who fit their operational model. Leonard asked what would happen to his Massey Ferguson customers. Craig said they'd be transitioned to John Deere equipment over time, but in the interim, Deere would continue to support Massey service and parts as long as it made business sense. Leonard asked how long the interim meant. Craig smiled and said that would depend on market conditions. Leonard told Craig he needed time to think. Craig said of course, but the offer wouldn't stay on the table forever. Deere had other options in the region. They were giving Leonard first right of refusal out of respect for his reputation. But if he passed, they'd pursue other avenues. It was a polite threat wrapped in corporate language, and Leonard understood it perfectly. He spent the next 2 weeks agonizing over the decision. He talked to his accountant, his lawyer, his son, who told him to take the money and retire, his daughter, who said the same thing. He talked to a few of his oldest customers, guys who'd been buying from Jorgensen Implement since the 1970s, asked them what they thought. Most of them said, "Leonard, you've earned this. If you want to sell, sell. We'll figure it out." But one farmer, a guy named Walt Erickson, who ran 2,800 acres north of town, said something that stuck with Leonard. He said, "I don't trust John Deere corporate. They're not interested in serving farmers. They're interested in market share. If you sell to them, they're going to gut this place within 2 years and turn it into a green paint showroom. Your staff will be gone. Your Massey customers will be orphaned, and everything you built will disappear." Walt said, "If you sell to someone who gives a damn about what you built, not to someone who sees it as a real estate acquisition." Leonard thanked Walt and went home, sat at his kitchen table that night and stared at the offer. $6.8 million, enough to retire comfortably, enough to stop worrying, enough to finally step away from a business that had consumed his entire life. He thought about his father, about his grandfather, about the farmers who'd trusted him for decades. And then he thought about being 71 years old and still working 60-hour weeks, about having no succession plan, about what would happen to the dealership if he had a heart attack or a stroke and there was nobody to take over. On May 3rd, 2018, Leonard called Craig Whitmore and accepted the offer. The deal closed on June 29th. John Deere took ownership of the property, the inventory, the customer list, and the Jorgensen Implement name. Leonard walked away with $6.8 million and a consulting contract that paid him $8,000 per month for 1 year to help with the transition. The first 3 months were fine. Deere kept the existing staff, kept the Massey Ferguson service department running, kept honoring the parts orders and warranty work. They rebranded the building with John Deere signage but left the Massey inventory on the lot. Craig Whitmore told Leonard they were committed to a smooth transition, said they valued the relationships Leonard had built, said the goal was to maintain customer trust while gradually introducing Deere equipment as a premium option. Leonard wanted to believe it. He showed up at the dealership every day as part of his consulting role, walked the lot, talked to customers, helped the new Deere managers understand the local market. But he started noticing small changes. The parts department was reorganizing. Massey components were being moved to the back shelves. Deere parts were getting priority placement. The service schedule was shifting. Deere equipment was getting same-day attention. Massey repairs were being pushed to the end of the week. By October, the changes accelerated. Deere brought in a new general manager from Iowa, a guy named Todd Kensington, who had no connection to South Dakota and no interest in building one. Todd's mandate was clear: convert the location into a high-volume John Deere dealership within 18 months. That meant aggressive sales targets. That meant pushing Deere equipment on every customer who walked through the door. And that meant deprioritizing anything that didn't contribute to those goals. Todd started with the staff. He called a meeting in early November and announced that the dealership was restructuring. Several positions were being eliminated due to redundancy. 3 parts department employees were let go. The Massey Ferguson service specialist, a guy named Gene Halverson, who'd worked for Leonard for 23 years, was offered a position in the general service bay at reduced pay. Gene quit instead. 2 sales guys who'd been with Leonard for over a decade were told their roles were being consolidated. Both were gone by Thanksgiving. Leonard watched it happen and felt sick. These were people he'd hired, people he'd worked alongside for years, people who'd built relationships with the customer base, and they were being discarded because they didn't fit Deere's operational model. He tried to intervene, called Craig Whitmore and complained. Craig said the staffing decisions were Todd's to make. Said Deere had to run the business efficiently. Said Leonard's consulting contract didn't give him operational authority. Leonard realized he'd been played. The consulting contract wasn't about transition support. It was about keeping him quiet for a year while Deere dismantled everything he'd built. They'd paid him $8,000 a month to watch silently while they gutted his life's work. By January 2019, the Massey Ferguson inventory was gone. Deere had sold off the remaining new stock at cost just to clear the lot. Used Massey equipment was shipped to an auction house in Nebraska. The lot was repainted green and yellow. The building signage was updated to remove any reference to Massey Ferguson or Jorgensen implement. It was now Deere Country Huron, and the only equipment on the lot was John Deere. The parts department followed. Deere stopped ordering Massey components, told customers they could special order parts, but lead times were 2 to 3 weeks, and there was a minimum order fee. For farmers who needed parts immediately, that was unacceptable. They started driving to other dealers. Some went to Brookings, 60 miles east. Some went to Aberdeen, 90 miles north. A few just switched to John Deere because it was easier than driving 2 hours for parts. Leonard's old customers started calling him at home, asking what happened, asking why the dealership didn't stock Massey parts anymore, asking why Gene was gone and why the service department wouldn't prioritize their repairs. Leonard didn't have good answers. He told them he'd sold the business and Deere was running it now. Told them he didn't have control. Told them he was sorry. One farmer, a guy named Carl Richter, who'd been a customer since 1974, called Leonard in March 2019 and said, "I've got a busted hydraulic line on my 8690. I called the dealership and they told me the part won't be in for 10 days. 10 days, Leonard. I'm in the middle of spring tillage. I asked if they could overnight it, and they said it's not worth the cost for one part. Your dealership would have had that part on the shelf, would have had it installed same day. What the hell happened?" Leonard said, "I'm sorry, Carl. I made a mistake." Carl hung up without saying another word. 2 months later, Leonard saw Carl's Massey Ferguson 8690 listed on an online auction site. Carl had sold it and bought a John Deere 8R. Not because he wanted to, because Deere had made it impossible to keep running Massey equipment in the area. By summer 2019, Leonard's consulting contract was up. He stopped going to the dealership, couldn't stand watching what it had become. Todd Kensington had hit his sales targets. The location was profitable. Deere corporate was happy, but the soul of the place was gone. The mechanics who used to know every customer by name were replaced by younger guys who treated service calls like line items. The sales floor that used to feel like a conversation between equals now felt like a high-pressure showroom. And the farmers who'd trusted Leonard for decades felt betrayed. Leonard started hearing stories. Farmers who'd been quoted one price on the phone and charged another at pickup. Service work that used to be covered under goodwill now required paid diagnostics. Equipment that used to come with dealer support now came with referrals to corporate customer service lines. The relationship-based business model Leonard had built was dead. Deere had replaced it with a transaction-based system optimized for volume and margin. In early 2020, Deere made another change. They reduced the Huron location's operating hours, cut Saturday service, scaled back the parts department to just-in-time inventory. Todd Kensington had been promoted to regional manager. His replacement was a younger guy focused entirely on new equipment sales. Used inventory was down to almost nothing. Service bays that used to run at full capacity were half empty. The facility was profitable on paper, but it was serving half as many customers as it had under Leonard's ownership. Then COVID hit, and Deere made the final move. In August 2020, they announced the Huron location was being consolidated. Service and parts would be handled out of Brookings and Watertown. The Huron building would remain open for sales only, with reduced staff and limited hours. By October, the service bays were closed. By December, the parts department was gone. And by February 2021, the building was empty. Deere sold the property to a commercial storage company for $2.4 million. The Massey Ferguson sign that had stood on Highway 14 for 52 years was taken down. The building was repainted beige, and the lot that used to hold rows of red and silver tractors was now filled with storage units. Leonard drove past it one day and had to pull over. He sat on the side of the road and stared at what used to be Jorgensen Implement, and he realized he'd killed it. Not intentionally, but effectively. He'd sold to a corporation that had no interest in preserving what he'd built. They'd wanted the real estate, the customer list, the market access, and once they had it, they'd extracted what was valuable and discarded the rest. Leonard couldn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about the farmers he'd served, the relationships he'd destroyed by selling, the trust he'd broken, and he realized he owed them an explanation, an apology, something more than silence. He started writing letters, personal letters, handwritten, one to every customer who'd been with him for more than 10 years. He didn't make excuses, didn't blame Deere. He just told the truth. He said he'd sold because he was tired and had no succession plan. He said he'd believed Deere's promises about maintaining service standards. He said he'd been naive about corporate acquisition strategies. And he said he was sorry. Sorry for prioritizing his retirement over their needs. Sorry for trusting a corporation that saw them as revenue targets instead of people. Sorry for not fighting harder to find a better buyer. He mailed 73 letters in March 2021. He didn't expect responses. He just needed them to know he understood what he'd done. But responses came anyway. Some were angry. One guy sent the letter back with "too late" written across it in red ink. But most were understanding. Sad, but understanding. A few thanked him for the honesty, said they appreciated knowing what had happened behind the scenes. One response stood out. It was from Walt Erickson, the farmer who'd warned Leonard not to sell the Deere. Walt's letter was short. It said, "Leonard, I told you this would happen, but I also know you were in an impossible position. You built something good and there was nobody to hand it to. That's not your fault. What happened after you sold is Deere's fault. Don't carry that alone." And then at the bottom, Walt had written, "I kept your letter. I'm going to frame it and hang it in my shop. Not to shame you, but to remind myself what happens when corporations buy out the people who actually give a damn." Leonard cried when he read that, because Walt understood that Leonard had been caught between legacy and survival, that there were no good options, that selling to Deere had been a mistake, but keeping the dealership going without a succession plan would have been a disaster too. The tragedy wasn't that Leonard sold. It was that there was nobody worth selling to. No independent dealer who could take over, no family member willing to step in, no path forward that preserved what 3 generations had built. Over the next year, Leonard heard from other farmers who'd received his letters. A few sent photos. They'd framed the letters, hung them in their shops. One guy put his next to a photo of the old Jorgensen Implement building from 1974. Another hung it above his workbench next to his grandfather's tools. The letters became something Leonard hadn't intended. They became artifacts, evidence of what used to exist in rural communities, dealer relationships that spanned generations, businesses built on trust instead of contracts, and the confession of a man who'd traded all of that for a retirement check and regretted it. Leonard lived 4 more years. He never went back to the storage facility that used to be his dealership. Couldn't stand to see it. But he drove past the farms that used to be his customers, saw the John Deere equipment in the fields, saw a few Massey Fergusons still running, probably held together with parts ordered from dealers 2 hours away. And he wondered if any of those farmers thought about him, about the dealership that used to be there, about the service they used to get. He died in November 2025. Heart attack, quick and relatively painless according to the doctors. His obituary mentioned that he'd owned Jorgensen Implement for 39 years, that he'd served the farming community with integrity, that he'd been a fixture in Huron. It didn't mention the sale, didn't mention Deere, didn't mention what had happened after. But at his funeral, 17 farmers showed up wearing Massey Ferguson hats, old hats, faded, some from the 1980s, some from the 1990s. They didn't coordinate it, they just showed up that way. And after the service, one of them, Carl Richter, the guy who'd called Leonard angry about the hydraulic line, stood up and said something nobody expected. He said, Leonard Jorgensen made a mistake. He sold to the wrong people. And a lot of us paid the price for that. But he also ran the best damn dealership in South Dakota for 4 decades. He kept our equipment running. He helped us through hard years. He treated us like people instead of account numbers. And when he realized what he'd done, he had the guts to apologize. That takes something most people don't have. So yeah, he screwed up at the end, but he did a lot more right than wrong. And I'm not going to remember him for the last 2 years. I'm going to remember him for the first 40. The room was silent. Then someone started clapping, then another, and within seconds the whole room was on its feet. Not because Leonard was a saint, but because he'd been human. He'd made a catastrophic decision under pressure and with limited options, and he'd owned it. Hadn't hidden, hadn't made excuses. He'd written 73 letters admitting he'd failed the people who trusted him. And in rural South Dakota, that kind of honesty meant something. After the funeral, Walt Erickson walked over to Leonard's son and handed him something. It was the framed letter, the one Leonard had sent in March 2021. Walt said, I want you to have this. Your dad didn't die thinking he was a failure. He died knowing that some of us understood what he was up against, that we didn't hate him, that we respected him for telling the truth even when it hurt. Your dad built something good. Deere killed it. But what he built mattered. And this letter proves he knew it. Leonard's son took the frame and read the letter for the first time. His dad had never told him about writing them, had never mentioned the apologies. The son stood there in the church fellowship hall, reading his father's handwriting, and realized he'd never really understood what the dealership had meant to him. It wasn't just a business. It wasn't just a job. It was identity. It was legacy. It was 50 years of relationships that corporate consolidation had erased in 18 months. Over the next few years, more of Leonard's letters surfaced. Farmers shared them on social media, posted photos in equipment forums. The letters became a case study in agricultural business schools about the human cost of dealer consolidation. AGCO used them in internal training about the importance of dealer support and parts availability. And John Deere, quietly, started reevaluating their acquisition strategies in rural markets after several PR problems stemming from dealership closures that followed the same pattern as Huron. But none of that brought back Jorgensen Implement. The building still sits on Highway 14, still beige, still full of storage units. The lot where Massey Ferguson tractors used to line up in red and silver rows is now asphalt and chain-link fence. And the farmers who used to get same-day parts and service now drive 60 miles or order online and wait. In 2027, a Massey Ferguson 8S tractor broke down on a farm just outside Huron. Transmission sensor failure. The farmer called the nearest Massey dealer, which was now in Brookings. They said the part would take 4 days to arrive. The farmer asked if they could expedite it. They said no, the volume didn't justify the cost. The farmer hung up and called a retired mechanic who used to work at Jorgensen Implement, asked if he still had any old parts inventory in his garage. The mechanic said maybe. Came over that afternoon with a box of sensors he'd kept when Deere liquidated the parts department. Found the right one. Installed it for free. The farmer tried to pay him. The mechanic refused. He said Leonard would have had this part on the shelf and you'd have been running same day. The least I can do is keep that standard alive as long as I can. The farmer asked why he still had the parts. The mechanic said because I knew this would happen. Knew Deere would leave you guys stranded. So I kept what I could. It's not much, but it's something. The farmer went home and told his son the story. The son, 19 years old, asked who Leonard was. The farmer walked to his shop and pointed to a framed letter on the wall. Said that's Leonard Jorgensen. He owned the Massey Ferguson dealership in town for 40 years, sold it to John Deere, and spent the last 4 years of his life apologizing for it. The son read the letter, asked why his dad had framed it. The farmer said, because it's the only apology I've ever gotten from anyone in the equipment business. And I want to remember that when things go wrong, some people still have the guts to admit it. Leonard's letters are still out there, hanging in shops across 6 counties in South Dakota, reminders of a business model that doesn't exist anymore, of dealer relationships that were personal instead of transactional, of a man who built something worth building and then watched a corporation erase it for market share. The Massey Ferguson farmers who still run red iron in central South Dakota drive past that beige storage building and remember what used to be there. They remember Leonard. They remember Gene and the parts guys and the mechanics who knew their equipment by sound. And they remember the day the Deere sign went up and everything changed. Some of them still wear the old Jorgensen implement hats, faded, torn, barely readable, but they wear them anyway. Not because they're stuck in the past, but because they want to remember what it felt like when a dealership actually gave a damn, when a handshake meant something, when you could call at 9 p.m. during harvest and someone would answer. That world is gone. Killed by consolidation and corporate efficiency and acquisition strategies that see dealerships as real estate plays instead of community institutions. Leonard Jorgensen knew he helped kill it, and he spent his last years making sure people knew he understood what he'd done. The letters are his legacy now, not the dealership, not the 50 years of service. The letters, 73 handwritten apologies that said I sold something I shouldn't have sold to people who didn't value what it was. And I'm sorry. That honesty, in an industry built on marketing and branding and corporate spin, became more valuable than anything Leonard sold in his entire career. He died knowing he'd made a catastrophic mistake, but he also died knowing that some people understood, that some people forgave him, and that the thing he built, even though it's gone, mattered enough that farmers still talk about it, still miss it, still frame his apology letters and hang them where they'll see them every day. Jorgensen Implement is dead. But what it represented, the idea that equipment dealers could be partners instead of vendors, that relationships could matter more than transactions, that trust could be built over generations instead of destroyed in 18 months, that idea is still alive, hanging on shop walls across South Dakota, written in Leonard's handwriting, framed and fading, but remembered.